Why are the boosters not just the answer?
Well, I think there's a few things to bear in mind. I mean, I think personally, as we're seeing, as you said in your opening comments, we are seeing high infection rates in some European countries that have high vaccination rates. And we're seeing the same in the US, where we're seeing some of the southern states now have relatively low incidence of COVID infections compared to perhaps high rates in some of the northern states, which actually have better vaccination rates. And I think the key thing to bear in mind, there are other measures, both as society, we also need to follow, but also as well, I think we do need to accept that COVID is here to stay. And I think we can only do, so much in the end to curb the rate of infections. But also, this is a global disease, importantly. And even if we do boost and achieve, very high rates of vaccination immunity in the West, ultimately we still run the risk of potentially dangerous variants developing in other parts of the world, which could then just come back, and we may not be immune to those. So I do think we have to view this as well as a global problem, and ultimately, achieving 90 to 95% immunity across the world really needs to be the goal if we're ever going to use vaccines as an effective tool alone to be able to combat COVID-19.
Peter, there are so many different strategies globally, and the UK has been criticised by some parts of the world for ripping off the mask and just going with herd immunity that can be achieved through vaccines and infections, versus other places where you've seen zero tolerance. And China, of course, crops up at this point. And then there was another story recently out of Japan where they'd had so many mutations of the Delta variant, they were thinking it was no longer such a major threat anymore. What is the right approach from here?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think as we're seeing, certainly that we're getting an increase in the number of therapies that seem highly effective, and clearly that will help with the problem. I mean, we're also seeing recently some very good data from oral antivirals, which clearly are going to be, I think, a critical part of the way out of this pandemic. As currently the antibody therapies and some of the other treatments we're using are really only for those who are hospitalized or likely to be at risk of hospitalization, and they're fairly inconvenient to be administered and therefore really can't be used on a grand scale. I do think the oral tablets that we've recently seen data for will be very important in the future, as these, could be used both for treating those who develop symptoms, but also importantly, potentially for the prophylaxis. In other words, treating household contacts or perhaps workers in close proximity to an infected person. That way, reducing their risk of contracting COVID. And if that were followed, potentially those could then be a very convenient way for governments to be able to combat the problem. But I think ultimately, I mean, we do also need to look at, as a society, the continued use of things like masks, perhaps social distancing to some extent, events, and how close in proximity people are to one another. I mean, I think these will all need to be considered, for the foreseeable future, but they are only ever going to be followed to a certain degree. And you mentioned, what we're seeing in the UK. It is interesting to know, have we developed some sort of herd immunity earlier than other countries? Is it our choice of vaccine, with the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine to a greater extent? I don't think we know at the moment. And one of the things that came out from the discussion we had with experts at our panel at the Jefferies conference last week was that, in truth, what we've really learned is we don't really understand COVID-19 yet to the full extent. And I think that's one of the challenges we're facing.